You press your palm to the chill of the stone and feel it answer with a centuries-old cold. The hour is late afternoon, the November light thin as parchment, combed into ribbons by the Abbey's great windows. Beeswax and damp wool mingle with a prickle of frankincense that clings to your sleeves. Your breath lifts in pale ghosts. There are whispers everywhere. At the west door, beneath the organ loft, along the shadowed aisle where carved kings and saints look down with unblinking patience. Servants hurry past with armfuls of embroidered cloth. A gold thurible clicks softly against its chain. Someone has dropped a sprig of rosemary and scuffed it underfoot. You bend, pocket it without thinking, a priest's superstition against ill luck. The murmur at court has been steady for weeks, the most unusual royal wedding England has ever seen. You have blessed ploughmen and dukes, widows and boys scarcely, sporting a beard, but never a pair so starkly mismatched that rumor alone seems to ring the bells. The oak doors shoulder open. A draught runs through the nave like a startled animal, and you see at once that the rumors were not rumors at all. He enters first, Richard, anointed king at 10, now in the full show of 29. Tall, trained to poise, he wears the weight of his office as if it were a cloak that fits. The windows lay coins of colored light across his hair. The jeweled orphrey at his neck glints when he bows. It is a carefully made picture, though you suspect he would rather be remembered for a gentler portrait, a patron of music, of books, of a quiet peace he hopes to coax into being. Beside him, a small hand swallowed in a glove, steps that do not quite match the cadence of the procession. The bride is tiny, the daughter of Charles of France, Isabella, 6 years old, 7 by French counting if one is generous, though no amount of generous. Counting lifts her to his elbow. Her gown is French work, heavy with seed pearls stitched into vines that seem too old for her. The crown prepared for her is a child's diadem, yet it sits uneasy on a head still learning where to hold a comb. You steady yourself on the altar rail, and a rational catalogue starts in your mind. Alliances, plenipotentiaries, truces measured in seasons. Because the heart, when faced with a child in state robes, falters. You have seen girls married at 12 and 13, have murmured Latin over hands that trembled because they were old enough to understand trembling. This, though, is child and king, and the court has composed its face to accept what the age accepts. If anything, these are cautious times. Half a century since the plague first scythed England, a decade since a second harvest of death reminded everyone that tomorrow is an if. Men save what they can, coin, favor, God's mercy where it may be bartered. Kings, for their part, save kingdoms with marriages. Around you the sound swells and resolves, the mutter of nobles in velvet, the rustle of ladies' sleeves, the little coughs of freemen led into the side aisles to see history at arm's length. You watch the child's gaze travel, arches to candles to saints, wide, not fearful, as if her tutors had told her to count each symbol as though it were a lesson. The English court has learned to spend ceremony like coin. Tonight it spends, prodigally. Every gesture says, peace. Every brocade, peace. Every nod from earl to bishop to French envoy, peace if we can keep it. Richard's voice when it comes is lower than the stones, a careful pitch meant to carry, but not alarm. When he bends to her, you see the smallest exchange, his shoulder, angling to shield her from 1,000 eyes, the pause before he speaks her name. He is not, you think, the villains that balladeers love to sing into being. He is a man who has loved and buried a queen, who grieves and yet must weigh parchment and spear, treaty and oath. Anne of Bohemia's memory still gilds the edges of the court. England remembers her gentleness as if it were a civic virtue. The king's loss left him childless, dangerous to a realm that wants heirs as proof against storms. And so here he is, reciting vows that are as much a treaty as a sacrament. Facais, terms are known because they must be known. It is no secret that the marriage will not be consummated. It is written, whispered, blessed in the open so no one can pretend otherwise. The girl will be raised English while remaining, in the ways that count French. Her household a braid of languages, her letters home regular and supervised, her tutors instructed to make of her a queen who will be ready when time permits and politics require. It is an agreement that says, we will wait. It is a hope carefully phrased in the grammar of two kingdoms. You begin the words that belong to your office, steady and slow, and with each response the abbey finds its rhythm. Amen gathers and releases like a tide against the pillars. The child stands earnest, fingers tight around a small book she will not read tonight, eyes lifting to where the incense has made a fog of gold. When she answers, the French shapes her English, and a few courtiers smile to soften the sound. Richard answers and does not falter. You bless rings, you trace a cross where it must be traced, and the moment arrives that always arrives. The one where two people, whoever they are, become a narrative larger than themselves. You say the final words, and while your voice is level, your mind is not. For all the abbey's calm, you can feel the tremor running through London and across the water to Paris, through garrisons and guild halls, manor kitchens and chancery desks. It is the tremor that comes when a long war seems, if not ended, then paused with intention. The 100 Years' War has worn out parchment and patience. This child is the ribbon meant to hold shut the envelope. You notice little things because they are easier to carry than large ones. Isabella's braid has shed a pearl and no one dares stoop to find it. A page scratches at a midwinter itch and is stilled by a glance that could freeze wine. A French envoy leans forward when you speak of peace, as if hearing an instrument tuned. In the triforium behind carved screens, a boy too young to serve and too old to be hushed wedges himself between two stone saints and stares down at a queen his own size. If the court hoped for unanimous approbation, it will not find it. There are men here who believe peace dishonors victories bought at sea and on French fields, who taste ash when they imagine a truce stretching so long that their sons will have no wars to make their names. There are others who are simply unquiet at the sight of a child whose crown weighs more than her bones. But for the moment, dissent has been folded into velvet, laid aside with swords stacked in the porch. When it is done and you dismiss them with the church's blessing, the great doors gape to the dimming day. The procession reshapes itself for the city, trumpets, riders, torches catching in the damp, the king's cloak dusted with candle smoke. Isabella walks with steps you suspect she has practiced in a nursery, counting 1, 2, 3, for every breath. You watch them vanish into the close, into London's thicket of alleys and rumor and appetite. Somewhere beyond the river, clerks will begin copying this day into chronicles. In Paris, tailors will note altered measurements and nurses will remember a cradle grown suddenly airless of its occupant. In garrisons, men will polish harness more slowly. In markets, a woman will say to her neighbor, a queen, but a little one, can you imagine? The stories start at once. That is how stories survive. There is a temptation, always, to sort history into monsters and innocents, to pretend that a vow spoken for reasons of state cannot also be spoken with kindness. It is harder and truer to stand here where drafts tug at your hems and admit that people bear many roles at once. Richard is a husband only in name tonight, and a father in his expression. Isabella is a symbol and a child, and the future's hostage. You are God's servant and, inconveniently, a man who sees and cannot unsee. You pocket the rosemary as the last candles are snuffed. The abbey exhales, all that light turned back into oil and smoke and memory. You tell yourself that peace is made of such difficult seams that history is not obliged to be comfortable to be necessary. You wonder, not for the first time, what it costs a child to be called queen before she is tall enough to see over the altar rail. Later, when the city's clatter returns and the bells settle into their ordinary duties, you will recall a small detail that had not seemed large at the time. When the king lifted Isabella's chin so she could meet the moment squarely, her eyes did not flinch. They took in the arch, the candles, the web of faces, and then something behind all that, as if she recognized that the world had decided something about her and she would have to learn to answer back. For now, the nave is mostly empty, rib vaults, floating above you like a night sky caught indoors. You touch the stone again because the stone endures, and you think, treaties end, truces fray, children grow. And in that thought is both a comfort and a warning, as old as the abbey, and as new as the child who left it crowned. Paris in the 1390s did not sleep easily. By day it was a capital of brilliance, merchants in the Rue Saint-Honoré hawking silks from Lucca and spices brought over Alpine passes, scholars debating at the university, noblemen in their crested cloaks striding through the echo of bells. By night, it was a city of muttered prayers, shutters barred against thieves and soldiers of fortune, and a court whose gilded halls rang with both laughter and dread. For at the heart of the Louvre Palace, where banners of blue and golden fleur-de-lis fluttered, there lived a king whose mind was as fragile as glass, and a little princess whose earliest memories would be painted in alternating strokes of splendor and terror. Isabella of Valois was born there on November 9, 1389, the eldest daughter of Charles VI of France and Isabeau of Bavaria. Her cradle was carved from oak and draped with ermine. Her lullabies were sung in French, German, and Latin by nurses competing for favor. At her baptism, bishops traced chrism on her brow and proclaimed her a jewel of Christendom. Yet before she could walk, she learned that even palaces quake when madness rules. Her father was known to history as Charles the Mad, and madness is no polite word in these chambers. He would ride out for a hunt, laughing with his companions, and return pale, vacant, convinced his body was made of brittle glass. At times he screamed that assassins lurked behind every heiress, bolting into corners with the terror of a hunted man. He forgot his queen's name, forgot his own. Once he refused to bathe for months. Another time he insisted servants sew iron rods into his clothes to prevent his body from shattering. For a child, such episodes were storms that broke without warning. One day her father lifted her into the air, peppering her cheeks with kisses, promising dolls or a pet hound. The next, she was hurried away by maids as courtiers carried the king raving to a darkened chamber, his eyes wild with phantoms. The young Isabella's world was made of corridors that smelled of candle smoke and fear. Whispers cut off when she entered the room, and the haunting sense that love could turn to horror in the blink of an eye. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, was formidable, admired for her beauty, feared for her sharpness. She had crossed the Alps as a Bavarian bride, shrewd enough to understand that her husband's weakness made her both essential and endangered. She cultivated allies, commanded loyalty with coin and charm, and above all, saw her children as pieces on a political chessboard. The French throne wavered under Charles's illness, and every daughter's marriage was an opportunity to build a scaffold strong enough to hold the crown. To Isabella she gave affection, yes, but also a calculating gaze. You will not merely be a daughter, you will be a treaty one day. And beyond the palace walls stretched a kingdom bled by war. For over half a century, France and England had locked swords in what was already called La Guerre de Cent Ans, the 100 Years' War. To peasants in Picardy and Gascony, it was less a name than a life sentence. Crops burned in chevauchés, raids, villages emptied by plague, men conscripted or slain. Children like Isabella grew up in nurseries hung with tapestries, but the tales told by servants carried the bitter smoke of ruined towns. War was not an abstract, it was the air she breathed. Isabella's education began early. Tutors placed a hornbook in her hand, taught her to cross herself with perfect reverence, drilled her in the courtesy of bowing to her elders. At 5, she could recite the genealogy of French kings back to St. Louis, as if learning that lineage might guard her father's crown. Her nurse whispered bedtime stories, but instead of harmless fairy tales, they often echoed the politics of the day, tales of kings betrayed, of princesses bartered to secure peace. Even play became rehearsal. With her dolls she enacted marriages, alliances, coronations, copying what she had watched in the Louvre's Great Hall. In the Louvre's gardens, she would chase butterflies, her laughter as light as any child's. But always nearby were the shadows, guards shifting their halberds, courtiers murmuring, servants watching for the next sign of the king's decline. When her father was lucid, she adored him, his voice rich, his smile radiant, his stories filled with knights and battles. When madness claimed him, she clung to her mother's skirts and learned the art of silence. For a royal child, silence was often safer than words, and above it all, the grinding war. By the early 1390s, both England and France were exhausted. Generations had marched to death under banners of lions and lilies, treasuries were hollow, fields scorched. Knights and commoners alike had grown weary of funerals. In both kingdoms, whispers of peace rose like fragile shoots after a long winter. But words alone did not mend old wounds. Words had been broken too often. What was needed was something tangible, a bond of flesh and blood that could not so easily be severed. That bond, it seemed, would be Isabella. At 6 years old, she was barely tall enough to reach a window ledge, yet already her future was debated in council chambers. French envoys polished their arguments. Her youth was an advantage, a promise of innocence, a symbol of new beginnings. English advisers weighed the benefits of a rich dowry and a truce stretching nearly 30 years, long enough for a generation to forget the sound of war drums. Neither side thought of her toys, her bedtime prayers, the way she practiced writing her name with an oversized quill. She was not Isabella the child, but Isabella the key, the bridge, the parchment made flesh. In the Louvre that winter, seamstresses bent over gowns far too heavy for her shoulders. Tutors slipped English words into her lessons. Queen, peace, husband. She repeated them as she might repeat a nursery rhyme, without grasping that these sounds carried the weight of kingdoms. Courtiers bowed to her with new deference. Their smiles seemed different now, as though they were greeting not a girl but a treaty already signed. The princess, unaware, skipped along marble corridors chasing a toy hound on wheels. Yet the air around her had shifted. She was no longer simply the king's daughter. She was becoming, before she could read the word, a bride. It began, as many things did in those years, with grief. Richard II of England, grandson of the great Edward III, had buried his queen in 1394. Anne of Bohemia had been no mere political consort. She was beloved, good Queen Anne, remembered, for her kindness to the poor and her quiet charity. Richard's marriage to her had been that rarest of things in royal annals, a union of real affection. When plague carried her off at the age of 28, the king had been inconsolable. He retreated from his court, draped his chambers in black, and ordered that the manor of Sheen, where she died, be torn down stone by stone so that he would never again set eyes on it. Courtiers whispered that their sovereign would never remarry, so deep was his despair. But a king cannot afford to be a widower for long, not when the succession trembles. Richard had no heir. His throne, won by inheritance and not always by love, could not be left vulnerable. The barons were restless, watching, and his cousins of the Lancastrian line waited like hawks for weakness. Into this vacuum stepped diplomacy. By 1395, emissaries crossed the Channel in secret, shuttling between Westminster and Paris. England's position in the 100 Years' War was ambiguous. Victories like Crécy and Poitiers lay in the past. Recent campaigns had been costly. France, meanwhile, staggered under the burden of Charles VI's illness, but her armies remained formidable. Both kingdoms needed respite, yet truces were brittle. Words alone, inscribed on vellum, were too easily shredded when ambition stirred. Marriage, however, was a bond sealed in flesh and sanctified by God. Thus emerged the startling proposal. Richard, 29 years old, would wed Isabella of Valois, barely 6. To Richard's counselors, it was a mixed offering. The French. Crown promised an astonishing dowry of 800,000 francs, money enough to replenish England's coffers for years. More enticing still, the treaty offered a truce of 28 years, longer than most men's lifetimes. England could turn its gaze north toward Scotland, or west to Ireland, without bleeding its strength across the Channel. Yet the child's age gave pause. Even in an age when dynastic brides were sometimes betrothed at 10 or 12, 6 was shockingly young. A babe, not a bride, some murmured. What possible legitimacy could such a union hold? Would England not become the laughingstock of Europe? And what of the scandal to Christendom, wedding a child to a grown man? The French envoys countered with elegance. Isabella's very youth was her advantage, they insisted. She had not yet been stained by the hatreds of war. Raised in England, she would grow into a queen who spoke with English tongue, who loved English customs, who saw her father's enemies as her own subjects. The marriage would be unconsummated until she reached maturity. That much was clear and binding. In the meantime, she would stand as a living symbol of peace, proof that France and England might, at least for a generation, cease to devour one another. Richard himself was torn. He recoiled at the thought of remarrying so soon after Anne. Some chroniclers note that when he first saw the miniature portrait of Isabella, his expression softened. She was small, solemn in her painted likeness, a child who looked as though she would need protection. Perhaps, courtiers whispered, Richard glimpsed in her not just a political pawn but the daughter he never had. To wed her would be to become guardian as well as husband. To shepherd her through the treacheries of court life might even soothe the wound left by Anne's death. The negotiations were intricate, stretching through months of argument. Envoys haggled over Isabella's household. Would she be permitted to retain her French ladies? Would she be allowed to write freely to her family? Could she practice French customs within an English court? Every clause was inked with suspicion. The English demanded guarantees that she would not be forced to adopt alien rituals too soon. The French insisted she must not be cut off entirely from her homeland. Above all, the marriage contract specified, in words meant to quell scandal, the union would not be consummated until Isabella was of age. While clerks bent over their parchments, the little princess played in Parisian gardens. Her governess began teaching her English phrases, while seamstresses stitched gowns heavy with cloth of gold. She was told gently that she would marry a great king across the sea. To Isabella it was no more real than the bedtime tales of enchanted forests. She traced letters on her wax tablet, practiced her curtsies, and laughed with her sisters. Unseen, diplomats weighed her life like coin on a scale. The stakes were enormous. For England, the dowry alone was a glittering prize, the truce even more so. For France, giving a daughter was cheaper than giving a province. And for Richard, beset by fractious nobles and haunted by his first queen's loss, it was a chance to steady his throne with French gold and French goodwill. He could for once claim to be the architect of peace rather than the perpetuator of war. Yet even as the treaty ink dried, skepticism lingered. The Earl of Arundel reportedly muttered that such a truce would make England weak. Better to keep fighting while the spirit of conquest remained than to raise a child queen who would remind men of compromise. But Richard silenced dissent with royal will. He saw in the French proposal not weakness but strategy, and perhaps, in some private corner of his heart, he welcomed the chance to guide a child who might one day call him more than husband, perhaps even father. Thus, in 1396, the bargain was struck. The world would soon behold a wedding that seemed at once grotesque and hopeful, scandalous and sacred. A king and a child, a peace bought with innocence, a treaty bound in rings and vows. In Isabella's tiny hands, whether she understood it or not, lay the hope of two kingdoms long drenched in blood. The road to Calais in the autumn of 1396 was a road lined with expectation. For months the treaty had been whispered in chancelleries and sung in taverns, but now it would take on flesh. Isabella, dressed in finery that seemed absurd on so small a frame, was carried north from Paris in a procession glittering with French nobility. Her nurses hushed her when she tired. Her governess reminded her that she must walk with careful grace before kings and bishops. She could not have known that every mile shortened the war-weariness of two realms, that every step was watched by men calculating the worth of her presence. Calais, an English stronghold set like a thorn in French soil, was chosen for the wedding. It was neutral ground, though neutral only by the standards of the 100 Years' War, that is, not burning at that particular moment. The city bristled with fortifications, its walls still scarred by sieges, but inside the castle hall, banners were unfurled and floors strewn with rushes. Here, on October 31st, 1396, Isabella and Richard were wed in a ceremony at once intimate and monumental. Imagine the hall, torches sputtering, their smoke pressed flat against stone arches, French and English nobles shifting in uneasy proximity, suspicion never far from their eyes, and in the center, a girl of 7 trying not to stumble under the weight of her golden gown. Chroniclers say the fabric was so heavily embroidered with pearls that she needed assistance simply to move. Richard, bending down, took her hand with something like tenderness. He exchanged rings with her, kneeling to meet her gaze, and when she faltered before the crowd's gaze, he tilted her chin gently upward. Witnesses remembered that gesture, the king not as conqueror, but as protector. Yet the hall carried tension. To many of Richard's English courtiers, this peace looked like surrender. To the French, it was a wary truce with a king notorious for sudden tempers and shifting affections. But vows spoken in God's name are not easily revoked, and when the priest proclaimed them bound, the applause was genuine enough to echo from the rafters. For a moment, Calais was less fortress than bridge. But one ceremony was not enough. England demanded spectacle, a public display to silence dissent. So, a year later, Isabella crossed the Channel. At Dover, she was received with pageantry fit for a monarch twice her age, and in London, the streets surged with onlookers. On a November morning in 1397, she was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey, the same nave where you, as priest, had first seen her walk. Chroniclers note that the crush of people was so great, several were trampled to death, desperate for a glimpse of the child queen. Londoners had heard tales of her, this tiny French bride. Some came out of curiosity, others from loyalty, others from suspicion. Would she be a puppet for French intrigue? The city dressed itself in banners, red roses, English lions, lilies of France entwined with Tudor roses, symbols of a marriage meant to quiet centuries of hatred. Along the route, apprentices cheered, fishwives shouted blessings, and the smoke of roasting meats drifted through the air. Isabella, lifted in a litter decorated with roses and fleur-de-lis, waved as she had been taught. She smiled, though she understood little of the language shouted back at her. Inside Westminster Abbey, the pageantry was overwhelming. The archbishop placed a crown, specially crafted for her small head, upon her braids. English duchesses, chosen as her guardians, carried the heavy train of her gown. The child sat solemnly, responding in rehearsed English phrases, while nobles knelt and pledged allegiance. For the crowd, it was both marvel and reassurance. She was truly their queen, invested with all the holy ceremony of the realm. The coronation feast lasted 3 days. Jesters capered, musicians filled the hall with song, and actors performed allegories of peace, France and England clasping hands, war banished to the shadows. The high tables glittered with silver and gilt, roasted peacocks were served in there, feathers and spiced wine flowed like water. Isabella sat beside Richard, eating cautiously, displaying the manners drilled into her by her French tutors. She was, as much as possible, a queen. But under the laughter and feasting, unease coiled. Experienced courtiers saw the risks. A truce, no matter how long on parchment, could fray at the edges. Richard's nobles murmured that their king had bent too far toward peace, that he prized treaties over conquest. The Lancastrian line, Richard's cousins, watched with quiet calculation, measuring how such a child queen might weaken or strengthen his hold. For now Isabella was safe in her new home. But peace in medieval Europe was like glass, clear, fragile, and one hard knock away from shattering. Still, in those days of 1397, hope shimmered. Isabella was installed in her apartments at Westminster, a miniature court within the palace, blending French attendance with English. She was given a crown, a title, and a people. At 7 years old, she became what few children ever dream of, becoming the living embodiment of a fragile peace, a treaty walking on 2 small feet. For a time, the years after her coronation felt like calm water spreading outward after a storm. Isabella's apartments at Westminster were arranged with careful thought. Her bedchamber hung with rich tapestries, a private chapel where she could kneel on a velvet cushion, a garden enclosure where she could play beneath the watchful eyes of ladies-in-waiting. French attendants whispered to her in the language of her childhood, while English governesses patiently corrected her accent. The household was a braid of 2 cultures, designed to raise her as both daughter of France and Queen of England. Richard himself, though nearly 3 decades her senior, became a constant presence. He would arrive bearing gifts, exotic birds from Ireland, illuminated manuscripts from Oxford, jeweled trinkets crafted in London workshops. Chroniclers note he seemed to enjoy her company in a way that went beyond duty. Perhaps he saw in her not only a queen, but the child he never had. When he sat with her in her study, guiding her small hand over English words, there was in him a gentleness that surprised even his critics. He had been known for bursts of temper and ruthless decisions. Here with Isabella, he was patient, almost fatherly. Her days fell into a rhythm of lessons and play. Mornings began with prayers, followed by instruction in languages, French, English, and Latin, then reading and writing. Tutors drilled her in deportment, how to curtsy to a duke, how to accept a goblet with poise, how to greet a bishop with words of piety. She learned to prefer wine to ale, as was English custom, to wear her hair in the courtly fashion, and to walk the long corridors with the quiet dignity expected of a queen. The afternoons often belonged to companionship. Medieval courts were full of children, daughters of nobles raised alongside royalty, pages apprenticed to serve, young cousins sent to learn manners. Isabella found friends among them, but none closer than Margaret Holland, daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret, just 2 years older, seemed impossibly sophisticated to the little queen. She taught Isabella English children's games, whispered court gossip in her ear, and explained which ladies could be trusted with secrets. Together they stitched embroidery in Isabella's private garden, or played with pet dogs while their governesses looked on. Margaret also became Isabella's guide to English politics. To a child who had grown up with the instability of her father's madness, it was astonishing to learn that Richard, too, had enemies among his nobles. Margaret spoke of barons who had rebelled in Richard's youth, of lords who grumbled that the king listened too much to favorites and too little to his counsel. "The king is strong now," Margaret explained, "but in England, power is never only the king's. The lords watch, and they wait." Isabella listened carefully. Even at 8 years old, she was beginning to understand that her life was bound to forces far greater than herself. One of her tutors, a clerk named Master William, deepened this awareness. He loved maps and would spread great parchment charts across the floor of her study. Isabella would kneel beside him, tracing coastlines with her finger, learning how rivers fed wars and how narrow seas shaped empires. "See here, Your Grace," he told her, pointing at the thin waters between Dover and Calais. "This channel has been both bridge and barrier. Your marriage may teach it to be only bridge." The child nodded solemnly, as if she grasped the enormity of her role. Perhaps she did. Richard's visits often included lessons as well. He would sit with her as minstrels played, or listen to her recite her lessons, praising her efforts with the indulgence of an uncle. Sometimes he told stories of his own youth, the rebellion of the peasants when he was just a boy, the coronation where he had been lifted high above the crowd. He seemed to want her to know the burdens of kingship, but gently, as if telling a fable. The court itself watched this unusual pair with curiosity. Some muttered that the king played at fatherhood rather than rule, others that the child queen was already learning to wield subtle influence. Whatever the truth, Isabella thrived. She grew in confidence, her English became fluent, her manner graceful. Visitors noted her intelligence, her quick wit. The little girl who had once looked lost in Westminster's vast stone halls now walked them with sure steps. And yet beneath the surface of peace, currents stirred. Richard's barons grumbled more openly. Some believed he had bought peace at too high a price. Others feared his reliance on French counselors in Isabella's household. But for the young queen herself, these tensions remained distant. To her, the years 1397 and 1398 were years of learning, laughter, and a growing sense of belonging. In the evenings, after the lessons and formalities were done, she sometimes sat by a window overlooking the Thames. She traced the slow movement of boats with her finger, imagining the soldiers and ambassadors who sailed those waters, bringing both war and peace. She was only a child, but she was beginning to understand that she was more than a girl in a gown. She was a symbol, a hope, a fragile bridge between two kingdoms that had known nothing but blood for 60 years. And symbols, though revered, are fragile things. Isabella's childhood calm would not last. Already beyond the palace walls, events were shifting. Richard's nobles whispered in corners, and across the sea, a cousin named Henry Bolingbroke was preparing to test the strength of Richard's crown. For now, Isabella was safe, cherished, and learning. But the lessons she was about to face would not come from tutors or friends. They would come from the brutal arithmetic of politics, from rebellion and betrayal, from the cold truth that peace is never secure. For the moment, though, she smiled at Margaret's stories, practiced her embroidery, and leaned close to her. Tudor's maps, a child queen growing into her role, unaware that the fragile glass of peace was already beginning to crack. The first hints of unease arrived not with trumpets, but with silences. By the opening months of 1399, Isabella noticed her world shifting in ways she could not name. When she entered the presence chamber, conversations ceased more abruptly than before. Her ladies-in-waiting, those chosen carefully from both England and France, exchanged glances heavy with meaning, then smiled too brightly when she asked what troubled them. Even Margaret Holland, usually brimming with chatter and confidence, grew distracted, her laughter thinner, her eyes darting toward doors as if expecting someone to burst through. Richard himself was altered. He had always come to her with gifts and stories, but now his visits were shorter, his words heavier. Sometimes he stood at her window staring toward the Thames, silent for long stretches, the way her own father sometimes stared into nothing during his episodes. Once when she asked if he would bring her a new book, he looked startled, as though dragged back from some deep place, and murmured, "Yes, my dear child, if God wills." Gone were the easy smiles, the gentle indulgences. Something larger than her education and play pressed upon him, though she did not yet understand what. The truth was whispered everywhere except to her. Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin, had returned from exile. He claimed only to seek his inheritance, stripped from him by the king, but his banners told a different story. Nobles who had long resented Richard's rule began to flock to him. England's barons, weary of the king's reliance on favorites and distrustful of his overtures to France, saw in Bolingbroke a chance to restore balance, or to seize power, for themselves. Isabella's first taste of the crisis came one summer morning, when she discovered several of her English attendants had vanished. When she asked where they had gone, her French governess hedged, "Called away for duties elsewhere, Your Grace." But the fear in her eyes betrayed her. By afternoon, the courtyard below Isabella's windows thrummed with the clatter of armed men. Their livery was unfamiliar, their presence restless. That evening, Margaret burst into Isabella's chambers, pale with urgency. "You must pack," she whispered. "Only what you need. We leave tonight." "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling though she tried to steady it. "To the Tower," Margaret said, and though she spoke gently, Isabella felt the words strike like cold iron. She knew enough now to understand the Tower of London's double nature. It was both fortress and palace, but also prison. Kings had kept their enemies there, and sometimes their kin. To be taken there for safety was to be hidden behind stone, protected or confined depending on how fortune shifted. The journey was unlike any procession Isabella had ever known. No bright banners, no cheering crowds. Instead, she was carried through London streets under the cover of night, her litter flanked by heavily armed guards. The curtains were drawn, but sound seeped in, not the bustle of markets but the low growl of voices, the slam of shutters, the tramp of boots on cobblestones. It felt as if the whole city held its breath. At the Tower she was lodged in apartments comfortable enough, embroidered cushions, tapestries, polished floors, but their windows were barred, and guards stood posted at every entrance. Her French ladies were permitted to stay, but most of her English attendants had been dismissed. For the first time since her arrival in England, Isabella felt utterly cut off, the fragile web of affection and companionship she had spun unraveling in a single night. 2 days later, Richard came. Isabella could scarcely recognize him. The man who had once knelt to her level and guided her hand across letters now looked worn, his clothes rumpled, his eyes rimmed red with fatigue. He dropped to one knee before her as he had done when they first met, but this time there was desperation in the gesture. "My dear child," he said softly, Our circumstances have grown difficult. There are those who seek to overturn the peace we built. Are you still king? Isabella asked, her small voice cutting through his practiced speech. Richard's lips twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. For now, he explained as best he could. Bolingbroke had returned with an army. Many nobles had abandoned him. The throne itself might be torn from beneath his feet. Isabella, only 9, listened with a gravity far beyond her years. She knew enough to understand. If Richard fell, her own fate would no longer be her own. "What will happen to me?" she asked at last. Richard bowed his head. "I cannot say. Henry may honor our marriage, or he may send you back to France. You may be safe, or you may be used as a bargaining piece. Much depends on whether he values peace with your father." In that moment, Isabella glimpsed the brutal truth of her station. She was not simply Richard's childlike bride, not simply France's daughter. She was a living treaty, and treaties are broken when convenient. The weeks that followed blurred into anxious monotony. The tower's walls, meant to defend, seemed to close in like a cage. Rumors swirled among her attendants. Richard had fled. Richard had been captured. Richard was marching north with an army. None could be confirmed. Isabella spent hours at her barred window, staring at the city beyond, trying to read in the smoke of hearths and forges what was happening in the streets. Then, one gray morning in late summer, she heard the tramp of new boots. The guards who entered her chambers wore different livery, red roses stitched on their tunics. Behind them came a tall, stern man with soldier's bearing and calculating eyes. Isabella rose and curtsied, as she had been taught, though her heart pounded. It was Henry Bolingbroke himself, now Henry IV, come to see the child who was queen no longer. The doors opened with the sound of iron against stone, and into Isabella's chamber stepped the man who had overturned her world. Henry Bolingbroke, now Henry IV, stood tall, broad-shouldered, the face of a soldier rather than a courtly king. His eyes were sharp, the eyes of a man who had fought his way to power, not inherited it. Behind him, his guards fanned out like shadows, their red rose livery bright against the gray walls of the tower. Isabella, just 9 years old, dropped into a curtsy so deep her knees trembled. She had been trained for such moments. A queen must never falter, no matter who enters her chamber. Henry studied her for a long moment, his gaze weighing her not as a child but as an asset. She wore her French silks, her hair carefully braided by her governess, her small frame dwarfed by the heavy furnishings of the tower. To him she was less girl than symbol, a link to France, a treaty in human form. "Your Grace," Henry said at last, his tone measured. He gave her the courtesy of her title, though she knew it hung by a thread. "I regret that circumstances require us to speak under such conditions." "What has become of the king?" Isabella asked. She did not say Richard's name. She did not have to. Henry's reply was swift, his words chosen with the precision of a man who understood both politics and theater. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king. He has abdicated in favor of my claim." Isabella's young mind caught the euphemism. Abdicated meant he had been forced. She did not press the point. She understood enough of politics now to recognize when truth was wrapped in courtesy. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered. "What becomes of me?" Henry's gaze softened, but only slightly. "That depends," he said, "on many things. Your father's response, the counsel I receive here in England, and perhaps most of all, your own conduct." It was a statement and a warning. Isabella was valuable, but only as long as she played the role required of her. From that day forward, her life became a delicate performance. Henry's counselors debated her fate in chambers she was never permitted to enter. Some urged that she be sent back to France at once to cut the expense of maintaining her household and free Henry from the shadow of Richard's treaty. Others counseled caution. Keeping her in England meant leverage. As long as the French princess remained under English watch, her father would think twice before breaking the fragile peace. So Isabella lingered in a liminal state, not queen, not prisoner, but something between. She remained in comfort within the tower, her meals rich, her gowns fine, her attendants carefully chosen. Yet the barred windows reminded her daily that her freedom was an illusion. She could walk the garden within the walls, but not beyond. She could write letters, but each was read and sealed again by English hands. Her conduct became her shield. She was endlessly polite to Henry's officers, never sulking or showing defiance. At the same time, she carried herself with dignity, refusing to be treated as less than the queen she technically remained. When she dined, she observed every courtesy her French tutors had taught her. When addressed, she replied in a voice steady beyond her years. Her very composure was a weapon, reminding all who saw her that she was not simply a child. They were dealing with the living widow of a king. Her French ladies proved invaluable. They whispered encouragement, reminding her that in France she was still seen as Richard's rightful queen. "Remember, madame," her chief lady, Madame de Courcy, said, "you are not a prisoner. You are a guest, a queen whose value is known to all. The English dare not cast you aside. Where there is value, there is hope." Isabella clung to those words, yet hope came mingled with dread. Whispers reached her of Richard's fate. First, that he was merely confined, then that he was dead, then that his death had been arranged by Henry's men in the cold stones of Pontefract Castle. The rumors swirled like a fog she could not disperse. When at last she learned the truth, that Richard was gone, the news struck her like a blow. She had never loved him as a wife, for she was too young to love that way, but he had been kind to her, protective, almost fatherly. In a strange land, he had been her anchor. Now he was gone, and she was left adrift. Isabella's grief was private, but it steeled her. She understood then with chilling clarity. If an anointed king could be cast down and quietly erased, what chance had a child queen unless she wielded every ounce of her dignity? If Richard's crown could be torn from him, so too could her safety be stripped away, unless she made herself indispensable. Thus the girl of 9 began to practice the oldest art of survival at court, the art of becoming both valuable and blameless. She learned to speak softly but firmly, to smile when observed, to weep only when alone. And though she was surrounded by stone walls, she carried herself as though they were a throne room. Henry may have taken Richard's crown, but Isabella refused to let him take from her the one weapon she still possessed: her presence, her poise, her unbroken sense of who she was. A queen, even in captivity. And so, in the Tower of London, the game shifted. Isabella of Valois was no longer Richard's child bride. She was a bargaining chip, a hostage, and a potential key to peace or war. Her childhood had ended. She would never be allowed to forget it again. The silence in the tower was broken not by bells, but by rumors, slipping through servants' tongues like smoke under a door. First, Richard was ill. Then, he had been moved to Pontefract Castle. Then, darker still, he had died. Isabella's ladies tried to shield her, but gossip seeped through the walls, carried by guards who spoke too freely after wine. By scribes who whispered in Latin, they assumed she could not understand. When the confirmation finally reached her, it was less a proclamation than a sigh. Richard II, her husband in name, was dead. Whether by starvation, neglect, or the quiet violence of murder, no one told her plainly. At just 10 years old, she grasped enough to know what it meant. She wept not as a widow for a beloved, but as a child for the man who had been her protector, the one constant in a foreign land. He had given her books, kindness, and a shield against the harsher truths of politics. With him gone, the walls of the tower seemed colder, the guards' stares sharper. Richard's death severed more than her companionship. It severed her last tie to legitimacy. She was queen in name only now, and Henry IV knew it. Within months, his council presented her with an ultimatum. She might return to France, they said, but only if she formally acknowledged Henry as England's rightful king and renounced all claims to the throne as Richard's widow. The proposal was a masterpiece of political calculation. If she agreed, Henry could parade her departure as voluntary, her renunciation as proof that his reign was unchallenged. If she refused, she risked languishing indefinitely as his hostage. At 10 years old, Isabella was forced to weigh choices that might shape the peace of kingdoms. Her French advisors argued bitterly in her chambers. Some urged acceptance. Safety in returning home outweighed pride. Others insisted she should refuse. Her status as Richard's widow gave France leverage, and her surrender would betray not only her marriage, but the peace Richard had died trying to preserve. Isabella herself remained torn. Part of her longed desperately to see her mother again, to walk once more in the gardens of the Louvre, to shed the suffocating stone of the tower. Yet another part of her, wise beyond her years, recoiled at the idea of betraying Richard's memory. To accept Henry's terms was to admit that her years as queen had meant nothing. In the end, the decision was taken from her hands. Across the Channel, Charles VI, her father, was in one of his fleeting, lucid intervals. Word came that he demanded his daughter's return at once. To deny him would be an insult no truce could survive. Faced with the prospect of renewed war, Henry yielded. Isabella would go home. The terms were vague, deliberately so. Officially, she was released, but each side told its own story. The English claimed she left of her own accord, renouncing her marriage. The French insisted she was reclaimed as a queen unjustly widowed. In truth, she departed in a haze of uncertainty, her future still unresolved. The journey back to France in 1401 was bittersweet. She traveled under guard, her entourage, smaller than the one that had once carried her to England with such ceremony. She left behind the apartments where she had learned her first English words, the gardens where she had laughed with Margaret Holland, the great abbey where a crown had been placed on her head before crowds that crushed to glimpse her. She was only 11, yet she felt already old, her childhood scattered between two kingdoms. As the ships carried her across the Channel, she leaned over the rail, her dark hair whipped by the salt wind. Behind her lay a country that had been both home and prison. Ahead was a land she barely remembered, a family reshaped by absence, and a court that would see her not as a child returned, but as a queen who had failed. She whispered to herself, in French and in English, the two languages now tangled in her tongue. Perhaps she whispered prayers. Perhaps she whispered promises. For Isabella of Valois, the sea was no bridge. It was a line drawn between what she had been and what she must now become. When Isabella set foot once more on French soil in the summer of 1401, she was no longer the laughing child who had left at 6. She returned an exile of sorts, a girl of 11 with the bearing of a widow, her English accented French marking her as both familiar and foreign. The court received her with celebration, but beneath the embrace of banners and music lay unease. France had not stood still in her absence. The palace she once toddled through now seemed a battlefield of factions, her father more broken than before, her mother more calculating than ever. Charles VI and her father was lost in one of his blackest descents into madness when she arrived. He did not know her. He muttered of assassins, wept over invisible injuries, and raged when courtiers tried to restrain him. When at last he emerged weeks later, lucid but fragile, he seemed bewildered by her presence. He asked once, in a voice trembling like old parchment, why she was not in England with her husband. The answer, because your ally was deposed, because your son-in-law is dead, was too cruel to say aloud. His madness had stolen more than reason. It had stolen continuity, leaving his daughter adrift even in his gaze. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was a different figure entirely. Regal, intelligent and feared, she greeted Isabella with open arms and sharp eyes. She knew her daughter's worth better than anyone. A child who had been crowned Queen of England, however briefly, carried prestige no dowry could match. Isabeau pressed her close, kissed her forehead, and then began to calculate. How might Isabella be used to France's advantage? Who might seek her hand? What alliances could be forged upon the fragile foundation of her English marriage? For Isabella, the adjustment was disorienting. Paris was at once familiar and alien. She remembered the gardens, but they seemed smaller. She remembered the courtiers, but many were strangers now, or bore themselves with suspicion. Some looked at her with sympathy, Others regarded her with wariness, as if she carried the taint of England in her silks. Her speech betrayed her. She spoke French with a faint English rhythm. She still preferred certain English fashions, her gowns cut in a style more fitted than French tradition allowed. Even her manners, drilled by English tutors, felt slightly at odds with the customs of her homeland. She had been raised as a bridge between kingdoms, and bridges never belong wholly to either shore. Isabeau set to work reintegrating her daughter. Tutors corrected her accent, seamstresses altered her wardrobe, and etiquette masters drilled her once more in French courtly manners. Yet Isabella resisted in subtle ways. She asked for English songs at feasts, for English books in the library. She spoke with warmth of the companions she had left behind, Margaret Holland, Master William the Tutor, even Richard himself. Some courtiers murmured that her loyalties were divided, but others saw in her not division, but strength. She knew both kingdoms now, inside and out. She could read England with a clarity no French noble possessed. This made her valuable. Diplomats began to question her gently. What was Henry IV like? How strong were his nobles' loyalties? What state were England's castles in? Isabella, clever beyond her years, answered carefully. She offered generalities, avoiding anything that could be used to justify war. She knew the suffering that war brought. She had seen it in whispers, in rumors, in the weight Richard carried like an iron cloak. When her mother's advisers pressed too hard, she demurred with a child's smile, but war talk swirled regardless. Henry IV's reign was precarious. Rebellion stirred in Wales and among England's northern lords. Some French hawks saw opportunity. If France struck now, could they reclaim lost territories? Could Isabella be used as a rallying symbol, the wronged queen of a deposed king, brought forth to legitimize a French campaign? The idea horrified her. She, who had worn the crown at 7, who had sat beside Richard at feasts, who had been greeted by London's apprentices and fishwives, could not stomach the thought of armies marching in her name, burning the homes of those very people. She did not love Henry, but she pitied England. It was a land of children like herself, caught in nets they did not weave. When asked her opinion, Isabella spoke with measured calm. An invasion would bring only blood. The English people will fight not for Henry, but for their soil, their hearths, their kin. And what would France gain? Ashes. Some scoffed at her softness. Others, especially moderates at court, were struck by her precocity. Here was a child who had already learned the cost of politics, who spoke not of glory but of consequence. Yet caution could not shield her forever. By 1403, suitors began to appear. Letters and proposals fluttered like banners. Isabella was young, but in noble circles, betrothals were currency. Her mother weighed them all, but one in particular drew her eye. Charles, Duke of Orléans, Isabella's cousin. A marriage that would keep her within the royal family, strengthen France's hand, and anchor her future at home. For Isabella, the proposal was more than politics. She had met Charles before in passing, a cultured man, older but with gentleness in his voice, a love for poetry and learning. After the hollow performance of her first marriage, the idea of a union that might hold genuine companionship stirred something within her. She was still young, but not as young as she once had been. The thought that she might choose, at least partly, felt like a new dawn. And so, in the shadow of her father's madness and her mother's schemes, Isabella found herself standing at another threshold. She had crossed from child to queen, from queen to prisoner, from prisoner to exile. Now she was to be bride again, this time on her own soil, carrying with her the lessons of England. That peace is fragile, that crowns are perilous, and that even the smallest figure on the board can alter the game. The proposal to wed Isabella to Charles, Duke of Orléans, arrived at a time when France was hungry for stability. By 1406 she was 16, an age when noblewomen were often already wives and mothers, but Isabella carried a weight her peers did not. She had once worn a crown, however briefly, and had been marked by loss and exile. To marry her was not merely to take a bride, but to claim a fragment of European history, a living treaty. a young woman whose story straddled two kingdoms. Charles was no ordinary suitor. He was 29, her cousin, son of the murdered Duke, Louis of Orléans, and already one of the most powerful men in France. He was known not only as a soldier, but as a poet, a man who loved literature and the arts as fiercely as he loved jousts and falcons. Isabella had met him as a child, when he was still her older cousin with a kindly smile. Now she saw him as something else entirely, a man who looked at her not just as pawn, but as partner. Their conversations, before the marriage was sealed, were remembered for their candor. Charles is said to have told her, "I do not wish to marry the widow of Richard, but Isabella herself." For a young woman who had spent her life being bartered between kingdoms, the words struck like sunlight. The wedding at Notre Dame in June 1406 was a spectacle meant to erase memories of Calais. Where her first marriage had been a quiet diplomatic transaction, this one was a festival of magnificence. Bells pealed across Paris. Streets were strewn with flowers. Banners rippled from every tower. Isabella walked the long nave of the cathedral, wearing deep blue silk embroidered with golden fleur-de-lis, a crown of sapphires and pearls resting on her dark hair. This time, her steps were steady, her gaze unflinching. She was not a child led forward by courtiers, but a young woman who chose, as much as any princess ever could, to walk toward her future. Charles awaited her at the altar, handsome in velvet robes, his face lit with unmistakable happiness. When they exchanged vows, their voices were clear, and they looked directly into each other's eyes. The chroniclers noticed it. Unlike so many royal couples, they were not simply reciting lines. In a political play, something genuine lived in the space between them. The feast that followed was a celebration of French culture and strength. Troubadours sang ballads of love triumphant, actors performed allegories of peace, and wine from Burgundy and Gascony flowed in abundance. Isabella laughed freely for perhaps the first time since her childhood in Paris. She was no longer the frightened girl of 7, dwarfed by gowns and ceremony. She was a duchess, a wife, and at least for now, she felt she belonged. At Blois, Charles's favored residence, Isabella found a world alive with music, poetry, and art. Charles gathered poets and scholars around him, and his court soon became one of the most cultured in Europe. Isabella thrived in it. She commissioned illuminated manuscripts, supported troubadours, and even established a scriptorium where texts were copied and preserved. Years in England had given her a taste for books and maps. Now she poured her energy into nurturing the same in France. In 1407, their first child, a daughter named Jeanne, was born. For Isabella, motherhood was transformative. Determined not to repeat the distance she had felt from her own mother, she insisted on nursing the baby herself. Despite protests from physicians and courtiers, she whispered lullabies in both French and English, promising her daughter a childhood warmer than her own had been. Charles, too, proved an affectionate father. He spent long hours in the nursery, marveling at the infant, sometimes reading to her as though she might already understand. This domestic happiness was a balm after the turbulence of Isabella's early life. At Blois, she felt a measure of peace. She and Charles debated literature late into the night, shared music, and walked gardens hand in hand. She had grown up used to playing the role of treaty and hostage, but now she was learning to be wife and mother, a role she embraced with a passion that startled those who thought of her as merely political. And yet, the world beyond their walls did not sleep. France was restless, divided between great houses vying for influence, while Charles VI's illness left the throne vulnerable. The Duke of Burgundy, ambitious and ruthless, eyed the power held by the Orléans family. The air at court bristled with suspicion, vendetta, and whispers of revenge. Isabella, though basking in her newfound domestic life, was not blind to these shadows. She had seen how quickly crowns toppled and treaties broke. She knew joy could be fragile. Still, she clung to the happiness before her, the laughter of her daughter, the companionship of her husband, the music and poetry that filled their hall. For a girl who had once been paraded through London as a child bride, who had sat behind barred windows in the Tower of London, this was a kind of victory. She had survived, and now, at least for a while, she was free to live not as symbol, but as herself. But peace never lingers long in medieval Europe. The shadows that circled her family would soon strike, tearing apart the world she and Charles had so carefully built. The serenity of Blois was shattered in November 1407, when news thundered through Paris like the toll of a death knell. Louis, Duke of Orléans, Charles' father, had been brutally murdered. The assassins struck in the open streets, hacking him down with swords and axes as he returned from a visit to Queen Isabeau. The killers belonged to the faction of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, who would later boast of the deed, claiming it was a righteous act to save France from Orléans' ambition. For Isabella, the murder transformed her life overnight. Her husband, once a prince and poet, became head of a faction plunged into deadly rivalry with the Burgundians. She had married into a household that suddenly carried the weight of vengeance, war, and survival. Blois, once a haven of song and scholarship, bristled now with guards and armor. Bodyguards shadowed Charles's every movement, and Isabella herself was surrounded by watchful attendants, her letters scrutinized, her movements restricted. The young Duchess adjusted swiftly, as if her years in England had been training for this. When Charles rode to campaign, Isabella managed estates, negotiated with vassals, and oversaw supplies for the army. Her letters from this period reveal a woman increasingly confident in governance. She balanced budgets, secured provisions, and used her natural diplomacy to hold allies to their promises. Though barely in her 20s, she had become a political actor in her own right. The civil war that followed, the Armagnac-Burgundian conflict, was vicious. Entire villages were razed, peasants scattered, trade strangled. Isabella could hear the cries of war even from within her secure walls. Refugees arrived at her gates, haggard and hollow-eyed, their stories of burned fields and murdered kin too frequent to ignore. She established charitable relief, providing bread, shelter, and safe passage. Word spread that the Duchess of Orléans was not only a patron of scholars, but a protector of the dispossessed. Her reputation grew, a figure of compassion in an age of cruelty. In 1408, Isabella bore her second child, a son named Charles. His birth brought both joy and greater peril. The infant was heir to the Orléans line, and thus a target for Burgundian malice. Isabella poured her energy into his upbringing, demanding that his tutors not only school him in Latin and chivalry, but in diplomacy, the art she believed would save him when swords could not. She watched him with a fierce protectiveness, determined that he would not grow up vulnerable as she had, a pawn shuttled between greater powers. The following year, 1409, brought both triumph and terror. Isabella bore a third child, a daughter, named Marguerite, but the birth nearly killed her. Complications set in, bleeding, fever, infection. For days she lingered between life and death, Charles at her bedside praying aloud, refusing to leave her even when advised that she might not survive the night. Across France, prayers were said for the Duchess who had already become beloved. Against the odds, Isabella recovered, but her body was never the same. The physicians warned her, another pregnancy would almost certainly kill her. For Isabella, it was a cruel revelation. She was only 20, but her health was already broken. The shadow of mortality hung over her days, yet she did not retreat into despair. If anything, her resolve hardened. She devoted herself all the more to her children, to her household, to the fragile alliances that held her family's world together. Her role with Charles became not merely that of supportive wife, but of co-ruler, partner, and strategist. Still, the war ground on. Cities shifted allegiance between Burgundians and Armagnacs. Raids devastated the countryside. The French crown itself was fractured, for King Charles II's madness made consistent leadership impossible. Isabella's Orléans kin became figureheads of resistance against Burgundy, and by extension guardians of France's uncertain future. She bore the role with poise, but in private she confided her dread. She had seen in England how a kingdom could crumble when nobles rebelled and kings fell. Now she watched her own homeland tread the same path. Her health worsened in 1410 and 1411. Chronic fatigue weighed her down, her lungs often heavy with infection. Yet she refused to surrender her duties. She sat with her children, guiding their lessons. She attended council sessions, her thin frame wrapped in heavy furs, her voice steady even when her body was not. "Strength is not the absence of weakness," she told a lady once, "but the will to rise in spite of it." Isabella of Valois, once the child queen of England, was now Duchess of Orléans, respected, admired, and feared by those who recognized her influence. But her candle burned faster than it should. The life she had built with Charles, a partnership of love rare in their world, was overshadowed by the war tearing France apart and the frailty of her own body. In moments of quiet, she must have remembered the Tower of London, the barred windows, the lessons of survival she learned too young. Now, once again, she lived in a fortress. The difference was that this time, she had chosen it, and within its walls, she fought for her family, her people, and her place in a kingdom on fire. By the spring of 1412, Isabella was only 22, but her body bore the weariness of a life lived at double speed. The childbirth that nearly killed her in 1409 had left lasting damage. Her breath came short, her strength waned easily, and fevers returned in waves that no leech or prayer could cure. Those around her whispered the word they did not yet understand: consumption, the wasting sickness that drained life slowly, as though a candle guttered by invisible drafts. Yet she refused to be still. Even as her health failed, Isabella insisted on overseeing her children's education. She would summon tutors to her bedside, listening as young Charles recited Latin declensions or as little Jean haltingly read her first prayers. She would lift her frail hand to correct them, her eyes alight with pride. She gave instructions for the management of estates, dictated letters to allies, and pressed her seal to documents even when her hand trembled. It was as though she sensed her time was short, and she would not allow weakness to rob her of duty. Charles of Orléans, her husband, watched in anguish. The vibrant, strong-willed woman he had married now drifted between moments of lucidity and days of fever. Yet even in her sickbed, Isabella retained the composure of a duchess. Visitors remarked on her serenity, the way she smiled faintly even when coughing racked her body. To her children, she offered warmth. To her husband, courage. To her allies, steady resolve. In the summer of 1409, peace negotiations had briefly flickered between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions. Isabella played her part, urging reconciliation, lending her name to petitions for mercy, her reputation as fair-minded giving her words weight. Though the talks collapsed, those who met her remembered her as a rare figure of moderation in a world descending into civil war. "She speaks not as one who seeks power," one envoy wrote, "but as one who longs for the sparing of lives." But her body betrayed her more each year. By 1411, Isabella's wasting illness was undeniable. She could no longer ride, could barely walk the long galleries of her residence without pausing for breath. The court physicians urged rest, but she resisted. She continued to write, to pray, to guide her household. She ordered that her children be prepared for a future without her, Jean to be raised as a lady of piety and culture, Charles to learn not only arms but diplomacy, Marguerite to know kindness and strength. She pressed upon their tutors that her children must be more than pawns. They must learn to choose, as she had striven to do. By September 1409, Isabella's illness deepened beyond recall. The wasting sickness hollowed her cheeks, dulled her once bright eyes. Those around her spoke in hushed tones, knowing the end was near. And yet Isabella did not surrender. She rose from her bed when she could, insisted on attending Mass, and dictated letters with careful precision. She made provisions for her children's guardianship, secured the loyalty of household retainers, and urged Charles to continue patronage of scholars and poets. "Even in war," she told him, "keep light alive. It is what makes us more than beasts." On September 13, 1409, Isabella of Valois died in Blois. She was only 20 years old. The news spread swiftly, striking France with grief. Chroniclers who had watched her grow from child queen to duchess wrote with sorrow of her intelligence, her kindness, her quiet strength. She had lived in 3 kingdoms, worn 2 crowns, borne 3 children, and endured more loss than most experience in a lifetime. Her funeral cortege was immense. Nobles from across France came to honor her, their banners dipping as her coffin passed. Clerics chanted psalms, peasants wept openly, and poets composed laments in her name. She was carried to the Celestine convent in Paris, where her body was laid to rest. For days, the bells of the city tolled, mourning not only the Duchess, but the hope she had embodied. Charles of Orléans was inconsolable. He had lost not only a wife but a companion of mind and spirit, a partner who had shared his love of poetry, who had guided his judgment, who had mothered his children with fierce devotion. In his later poems, fragments of Isabella's presence linger, a line about a smile, an image of a pearl, a sorrow too heavy to name. In her brief years, Isabella had been child bride, Queen of England, prisoner, exile, Duchess of Orléans, mother, and mediator. She had survived the Tower, outlived the king who wed her, and carved a place for herself in a France tearing at the seams. And though death claimed her early, her legacy endured, in her children, in the poetry of her husband, in the memory of those who had seen her strength in the face of fragility. Her story closed, but the wars did not. France spiraled deeper into civil conflict, England hovered at the edges, and the 100 Years' War would grind on. Yet for those who remembered, Isabella, her life stood as proof that even in an age of brutality, grace could survive, however briefly. The death of Isabella of Valois left ripples far beyond the convent walls where she was laid to rest. For Charles of Orléans, the blow was personal and devastating. He was still a young man, yet he had already lost his father to assassination, and now his beloved wife to illness. Later he would remarry, but those who knew him remarked that Isabella's memory never left him. In his poetry, composed during the long years he would spend as a prisoner in England after Agincourt, echoes of her linger like half-remembered music, lines of mourning, of absent love, of longing for gentleness in a brutal world. Their children carried her legacy forward. Jeanne, their firstborn, inherited her mother's dignity and sense of duty, entering the world of noble marriages where alliances mattered as much as affection. Marguerite, the younger daughter, too became part of the fabric of dynastic politics. But it was Charles, their son, who most clearly reflected Isabella's influence. He grew into a man of letters as well as of politics, celebrated as one of France's greatest poets, a patron of the arts whose verse often explored themes of captivity, endurance, and hope, echoes, perhaps, of the lessons his mother had whispered to him before she died. Yet her absence had political consequences. Isabella had been a voice of moderation in a court careening toward disaster. With her gone, the fragile balance tilted further into bloodshed. The civil war between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions deepened, fueled by vengeance and ambition. When Henry V of England renewed his claims on the French crown, the kingdom was already fractured, too weak to resist the storm that culminated at Agincourt in 1415. One cannot help but wonder, had Isabella lived, might her presence, her counsel, her ability to bridge divides have slowed France's descent into catastrophe? History rarely answers such questions, yet the contours of her life invite them. She had been born into instability, daughter of a king whose mind crumbled like glass, raised under the calculating gaze of a mother who saw children as pawns. She was sent across the Channel at 6, crowned Queen of England before she was old enough to understand the words of her coronation. Widowed at 10, returned to a homeland that felt foreign, and married again into a house destined for civil war. Through it all, she displayed a resilience that startled even hardened diplomats. It is tempting, from a modern vantage, to recoil at the image of a child bride in ermine and pearls, her hand clasped by a man more than 20 years her senior. To judge the past by the standards of the present is natural, but if we pause there, we risk missing something deeper. Isabella was more than a victim of her circumstances. She was a participant in them. However little power she had, she used. She learned to read both books and people. She turned the limited stage she was given into a platform for kindness, for diplomacy, for culture. In a world that treated her as a pawn, she discovered ways, quiet, careful ways, to be a player. Her story reminds us that history is not only the tale of battles and kings, but of individuals who endured those forces, shaped them, or resisted them in ways that do not always appear on maps. Isabella's choices were constrained, yet within those constraints she carved out dignity. She refused to be erased even when stripped of crown and title. Centuries later, when we look at her life, we see more than treaties and tragedies. We see the resilience of a child who survived exile, the courage of a widow who faced down a usurper, the tenderness of a young mother who sang lullabies in 2 languages. We see a woman who, though she lived only 2 decades, left behind a legacy of humanity in an age that often seemed determined to crush it. In the end, Isabella of Valois stands not merely as a footnote to the 100 Years' War, nor as the unfortunate child bride of Richard II, nor even as the Duchess who died too young. She stands as a reminder of the human heart within the machinery of history, a reminder that even in the cold halls of power, in treaties written on vellum, in marriages arranged for peace, there are faces, voices, children who grow into women and men whose lives matter beyond their political use. Her life was short, her role precarious, her time turbulent. And yet, in the fragments left to us, in chronicles, in poetry, in the very memory of her name, Isabella of Valois endures as more than symbol. She endures as a person, fragile yet unbroken, a bridge between kingdoms, and a testament to the quiet strength that survives even in the harshest of ages.